Welcome to the Geriatrics podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, who are our guests today?
We have our first repeat guest today. We have Vicki Jackson, who is Chief of Palliative Care at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And she's joined today by David Ryan, who is Chief of Hematology Oncology at Massachusetts General Hospital. Welcome to the Geriatrics podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Great to be back.
So we start off with asking our guests for a song for Alex to sing. Do you have one for Alex?
Sure. Springsteen's The Promised Land.
All right. The dogs on Main Street howl 'cause they understand. If I could take one moment into my hands, Mr. I ain't a boy, no, I'm a man, and I believe in the promised land. Something
well
like
done.
that.
That was awesome.
So you wrote a book together, Living with Cancer, a step-by-step guide to for coping medically and emotionally with a serious diagnosis. We're excited to talk to you about this book. Well, my first question is, how did you come to decide to write this book together?
So Vicki and I do, every other week we do rounds up on the inpatient service, and it's basically tough cases that are on the floor that the residents and the nurse practitioners are struggling with. And as is usual, we have to wait for them because it's 11 o'clock and they got a lot of things going on. And Vicki and I were sitting there, and I said, "Hey, Vic, do you have to call back friends of friends and friends of family with cancer diagnosis and explain what's going on and how to understand the diagnosis and the cancer and the treatment and end of life stuff?" And she said, "All the time." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Do you tell the same stories over and over again?" And she said, "All the time." And so I said to Vic, "How about if we write that down together and talk about all the stories that we tell patients to help them understand what they're going through? And how about if we have a book that's like what to expect when you're expecting, except it's not for pregnancy?"
That is a good analogy. That is great. And tell us about the process of writing this book together. How does that work?
Wow. I would say Dave and I have learned a lot in this that we didn't know at all, both being sort of in like an academic medical institution and not have ever written a book before. So we actually had to get an agent to help us sort of figure out how to navigate this, and then had to get, we have a writer who is a medical writer who helped us sort of take the stories and the information and make sure that it was really accessible. The thing that we didn't know is basically before you write a book, you have to write a book proposal, which is every single chapter, a portion of every single chapter and entire chapters. And it's, I don't think ours was like 80 pages, something like that,
right,
or longer. And then they shop it around to different publishing houses. And the thing that was really interesting for Dave and I in this is that there were a bunch of commercial houses that were like, "This is great. You guys are great. It's a fabulous book, fabulous idea, except could you take out that scary last part of the book and then put in something about nutrition, something like that?" And Dave and I were pretty clear that that just wasn't the book we were going to write. And if we couldn't have anyone interested in this book, then we just weren't going to do it. And then thankfully, Johns Hopkins University Press was interested in it, and we kind of went from there. But it was 3 years start to finish.
Yep, 3 years.
3 years start to finish. A lot of writing on Sunday mornings.
Now, it also seems like you include, so language is incredibly important. You include some fairly detailed language using specific diagnoses words that often are not discussed in the lay press. I can't remember.
Yeah, like
remember
NK1 inhibitors, 5-HT antagonists, specific types of adjuvant chemotherapy, etc.
So we wanted it to be accessible, but not dumbed down. So we wanted this to be something that patients and families, when they're taking notes in front of us, could go back and say, okay, what did she say? What did he say? And go to this specific chapter on nausea or diarrhea or whatever it was, and then match up their pill bottles and be able to say, oh, I get it now. I remember what he said. He said it's just like it is here. And we actually got great feedback on the symptoms chapters from, turns out Hopkins sends it out to oncologists and physicians to review. And the symptom chapters came back with great reviews. Like they almost had nothing to say. They said, can I send this out to my patients? Because it's a perfect little review for patients.
Yeah, I can imagine that patients hear all these words all the time, like pneumonitis and neutropenia, which generally probably makes no sense to the vast majority of patients and family caregivers. But they're going to hear it. Did that come into the thinking too, is that we have to label these words as they would hear it in the medical system?
Yeah, I think the way Dave and I really thought about this was, when we meet patients for the first time, the way I frame it in the outpatient clinic is my goal is for you to become a competent, capable cancer patient. I wish you didn't have to, but you will, and we're going to help you do that. And part of the way to do that is to educate you and empower you to ask questions. So we felt that we were going to try to let them in on what we were thinking as clinicians and how we frame these issues and the different tools in their toolbox that they could ask their clinical team about. So we really did try to make sure that it would be something that would be useful. And as Dave said, not dumbed down. This is about empowering people to understand themselves and understand how they can advocate for themselves.
Have you gotten feedback from patients or family members?
Yeah. So I was really scared that the patients, my current patients, wouldn't like it because we had done these videos. I've done a few media things in the past, and my past experience was that the current patients hate it because it's very truthful and open and honest, and the patients' family members or my old patients loved it, and so I was really worried that the current patients were going to hate it. But we've had great feedback. In fact, the patients knew we were writing it. And when it came out, they all bought books, and then they all brought them in to be signed. And they said, different parts of it that they really liked.
We should mention at this point that we're going to have a link to the book on the Jerry Pell post, and you can find the book there. I wanted to ask you a question about the first question that you suggest they ask their oncologist. The first question you want to ask after staging is what the oncologist hope the treatment will do for you, the goal of treatment. And by knowing the goal of treatment, you can choose better the options that are right for you. I wanted to, now it strikes me that I don't know that I've ever had or heard of a patient ask their oncologist that boldly about the goal of treatment up front. Is this something that's starting to happen in clinical encounters with newly diagnosed patients?
So that's a great question. The thing we wanted to impart about that was the beginning of understanding prognosis. So the hardest thing I think we do in the oncology clinic, and palliative care has been a great help with us, is prognostic awareness. And I think that we had thought long and hard about how to frame these first oncology meetings. And I always try in meeting with people for the first time, and Vicki can attest to this, I always spend the bulk of the time at the end talking about what is our goal of treatment? Is it and there's really only three things that we can do for any patient sitting across from us, right? Mm-hmm. You can cure them, you can help them live longer, or you can help them feel better. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about that in the book. It's cure, live longer, feel better. And once you start getting patients oriented around those three topics, everything else kind of falls into place. If you decide to take shortcuts or ignore that, I've always found in my own practice, I'm backing up. And so every time that I'm sitting and talking with an initial patient, I'm saying, are we trying to cure you? Are we trying to help you live longer? Are we trying to help you feel better?
So that seems much more accessible language than remission, response,
right. Progression.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I don't think we do a good job of teaching the fellows, particularly the oncology fellows, on how to communicate that in a good way.
I mean, this is this is terrific. It makes my palliative care heart sing. Starting the conversation with the oncologist from the get-go by orienting around goals of care. This is amazing. I mean, this would be a sea change, right? If we could activate patients to get their oncologist to refocus from the get-go on goals of care, that would be amazing, Ashley.
Well, you see why I love working here. But I think the other thing, though, to be straight up about, guys, is that, I, for the last 15 years, have been hanging out with a lot of oncologists, right? And I see them do this, and I see Dave do this, and patients variably uptake that information, even though the oncologist's been really straight about it and in very plain language. And part of the piece that we've also had to do over the years with talking with the oncologist is saying, okay, just so you know, you did a beautiful job there. The patient didn't integrate that. And they're going to come back again in a month and ask you, what do I need to do to be cured? And Dave, I don't want you to think you did a crappy job there, because you didn't. This is just how right now they're not able to integrate that information. And I think that sort of triadic relationship really helped, because I get it. Like, if a patient of Dave's doesn't understand, I don't think it's because Dave didn't say it. And Dave doesn't think I think he's a bad guy that he didn't do it. We just know that this is kind of how it goes.
But I would say 15 years ago, when we started this project of seeing patients together in the cancer clinic, it wasn't that way. Like, I know that I always thought the palliative care doctor thought I was a jerk, that I didn't talk to my patients and didn't really communicate. And I always thought that I did a really good job of taking care of patients' symptoms. And what I'd say the two biggest lessons, I mean, there's a bunch of lessons that we've learned from working with one another. Yeah. I'd say the two biggest lessons that we've learned are, A, I wasn't doing a good job taking care of my patient's symptoms, in part because you're so rushed in clinic. You're thinking about the chemo and the dose and getting them upstairs to infusion. And is that port working? Is, the nurse is yelling at you about it not flushing properly and yada, yada, yada. And then you never get to their diarrhea. On the flip side, I think what the palliative care doctors learned was that it wasn't that the oncologist, now maybe 15 years ago, some oncologists weren't talking this way, but it wasn't so much that the oncologists weren't communicating. It was that the patients weren't hearing, and maybe the oncologist thought the patient heard and just never kind of went back to it.
Yeah, I want to continue on this vein about prognosis and introducing the idea of prognostic awareness. You have a section in one of the next chapters on survival rates and how statistics themselves can be misleading. I'm looking at page 37 here. And I thought it might be interesting if we could ask one of you to read this section. My guess is, Dave, you wrote this section here when you're talking about, I worked with two patients whose experiences were cancer were the opposite of what the statistics indicated.
Oh, yeah. So Melissa had stage 1 colon cancer and a 90% chance of being alive in 5 years, and I told her so. Joanne had stage 4 colon cancer, and the survival statistics indicated that she had a 10% chance of being alive in 5 years. That was a difficult discussion, but I believe that doctors should talk to patients about what might happen if the treatments don't work as well as we hope. I was thrilled when Joanne's cancer responded wonderfully to therapy, and even happier when she underwent surgery and had the tumor removed. 5 years later, Joanne scolded me, saying that I should never tell anyone their survival statistics. She said that she had lived in terror during that first year, thinking that each holiday and family birthday would be her last. Melissa wasn't so fortunate. Despite having very hopeful survival statistic, her cancer returned in the 4th year after treatment. It became clear that the cancer had spread. She told me that I should have warned her more strongly that this was a possibility. She said that she would have lived differently if she had realized that time was so short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about this book is how the stories illustrate the point, but also sometimes the stories are surprising and they don't go the way that you think they're going to go, like these two stories here. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how how palliative care docs and oncologists should talk about prognosis with patients who are newly diagnosed with cancer, given that statistics can be wrong, people are individuals, they're not averages, and yet there is some valuable information there about what happens to groups of patients like the patient in front of you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way we talk with patients and teach others to talk with patients is we really love pairing hope and worry, right? So it's a way to give some broad scope of, we're hoping that you can do well for a couple of years. We also worry that because we see these other things, that time could be shorter. And often just people are not, what I think clinicians and hopefully palliative care clinicians don't worry about this, but I think what many clinicians who are not trained in this worry about is that we're going to be wrong, and then the patient is going to hold us to that, and we either over or underestimate it, and we lose all credibility. And I think this, I don't know if I've said this to either of you before, but this whole idea of pairing hope and worry came to me from a patient of mine who was actually when I was doing fellowship, he was in his 20s, and he said to me, Vicki, I want you always to be hopeful and always honest. And I was like, ooh, how do I do that? Right. And I said to him, what if I have information that I think is honest, but it's not particularly hopeful? And he said, I just want to know that you hope I would beat those odds. And I think that is a way to be very genuinely connected. And I think I would have to say in my clinical experience, when I've been wrong and people have lived much longer, like I remember a patient of mine who was actually a hospice medical director who asked me for a time-based prognostic disclosure. And he said, how long do you think I have? And I said, I hope I'm wrong. I worry it could be as short as a few weeks. He was going home with hospice, and he had a delayed response to chemotherapy. He lived another 9 months, and he came back to see me in clinic. And he said to me, I'm doing great. And I said, how do you feel about the fact that I was wrong? And he said, well, you said you hoped you'd be wrong, so I just thought you'd be happy. And I thought you're absolutely right. I am thrilled that I was wrong. So I think if we can continue that human connection, we don't have to be perfect. We're just trying to help patients and families so they can make decisions that feel right given what our best estimate is.
I think that's a great analogy. I always think about don't tell our listener audience, but I play the lottery occasionally. I know I'm not going to win the lottery. What are the statistics? 1 in 500 million. But I hope I will.
That's right.
And you can tell me, no, Eric, you're not going to win the lottery. And I'll think that's kind of rude because I'm still hoping it. You can't take away my hope. But I know, I worry I may not win it. I worry that probably I should not put my retirement ideas solely based on my hope for winning the lottery.
Yeah, it was purposeful that we used that story. That story actually happened to me, and I've actually, since that story happened, often in the first visit, particularly around adjuvant chemotherapy, it doesn't work so well in the metastatic setting, but around the adjuvant setting, it works really well. And I think the reason it works well is that the person who wasn't supposed to do well did really well, and the person who was supposed to do great did really poorly. And so it switches it makes people think for a second, and in that process of thinking, all of a sudden the emotion gets crowded out by the thinking. And it allows people to focus. I've found that story is a great tool to help people understand the issues that we have with statistics. And it frames it in terms of best case, worst case scenario.
Right. So one of the sections that struck me, because this comes up so often in clinical work with patients with serious illness, and you see this so often on TV. Right, John McCain just diagnosed with cancer, right? And all the messages are about positive thinking, and he's a fighter.
He's going to fight this
He's going to fight this, right? So you have a section in your book, I'm looking on page 242, 243, on the negative power of positive thinking. And I wonder if there's a section of this you might read, for example, the story about Julie. I think, Vicki, perhaps you wrote this? I'm not sure.
Well, just to be clear, so we would alternate back and forth writing chapters, but then we would edit each other's chapters. And so I think we can't even remember who wrote what anymore because it became, in between us and Michelle, it's all a blur. So we kind of run with it. So this is really thinking about the unfortunate negative power of positive thinking. I had a patient recently, Julie, who was having a lot of trouble sleeping. She had trouble falling asleep at night and then would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning with her mind racing. I asked her what she was thinking about when she couldn't sleep, but she didn't want to tell me at first. Finally, she admitted she was worrying about what would happen if her cancer got worse. She worried about her husband and how he would care for her if she were really sick, and how she would be letting him down if she didn't get better. Then she sat up straighter and said, "But I can't think like that. I have to stay positive." She wasn't really talking to me at that point. She was lecturing herself. She also said that if she didn't stay optimistic, she was inviting her cancer to grow.
Yeah. So what do you say to patients or their family members when they say, we have to stay positive, we can't talk about this?
Yeah. So the image that I would say in palliative care, I ask patients how they're sleeping because it's actually a really important key question, really, I think, with understanding how much anxiety they're having, even if they don't endorse anxiety when I ask them about it. Also with how comfortable they are with, sort of what their illness understanding is and how much they can tolerate emotionally being able to think about a likely illness trajectory. So what I say to patients is, and we try to teach them strategies about how to deal with that intense emotion, is I say to them, the reality is the fact anybody who has cancer, curable or not, if they didn't have times that they were worrying about what the future holds, that would be crazy because that's just not normal. Everybody should be worried about it. And what I say to them is what I notice in my patients is that sometimes they're worried that if they give voice to that, then that means that they're not going to do well, that they're going to give up, that they're going to become depressed. Sometimes if people want to know data about it, I say, our early intervention studies show the exact opposite, like being able to find a safe space to have these conversations actually, is associated with people having better quality of life, less depression. But I typically say to them, I think it's impossible, no matter how strong you are, to block all those thoughts out. And typically what happens is they come up at 3 in the morning and bite you in the backside. Mm-hmm. So we have two choices, either to completely try to block it out, which unfortunately I think is just not successful, or find a way that doesn't feel overwhelming to begin a dialogue about these things. And for people who are super resistant, we do what I sort of call talking about it. I'll say, well, what would that like when we if we would start talking about these topics? Who would be there? Would you want to make a list? Like, should it be like on a week that you're getting chemo or not? Like, it's a really kind of motivational interviewing sort of approach. And then for folks who are really more open to it, we sometimes use this, and a patient taught me this idea of using the box metaphor, which we write about in the book mm-hmm. too, is to say, you know what, like all these things that you're worried about, let's sort of put them in this box and use that to sort of contain it and compartmentalize it. And that we can decide together when we're going to open the box and how long the box stays open and when you're going to close the box. Because patients will often say to me, they worry if they start talking about these hard things that they're never going to stop. And then it just feels so overwhelming and flooding. Mm-hmm. So it's some conversation like that. And then we say, I try it for a little bit. I say, what if we open the box and talk about one thing that feels tough when you're thinking what keeps you up at night? Let's do that for a bit and see how that goes. And you can close the box. So to typically sort of, my goal is to have them feel safe and connected, but build the emotional and intellectual muscles to look at these hard topics.
I think those are two great keys right there, especially the sleep question. I never thought about that. I mean, I just think about myself. I do all my worrying right before I go to sleep, lying in bed, and then I can't go to sleep because I'm worrying so much.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you about a section that comes towards the end of the book, where you talk about the good death. I'm in chapter 24 here, and also about what a bad death is. And I think there is some there's some controversy about using these terms. Like, is there such a thing as a good death? Is there such a thing as the bad death? And this ties in with a little bit about the way sort of bioethics has swung and the norms of what's acceptable for doctors in society, and that it's swung from doctors know best the other way towards we should respect patients, what their preferences, their goals and values, even if that means dying in the ICU. But I think it's kind of maybe swinging back a little bit the other way because as you write about here, you do have a conception of what a bad death is, and you even label dying in the ICU as a bad death. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that balance between, respecting patients, their preferences, their wishes, and coming to it with your own sense of what a good death and a bad death is.
I would say we argued about this chapter, what is a good death, more than any other chapter. In fact, Michelle, who's not here, felt it was too negative. She was really upset. And then Vicki and I then argued about the 3 lessons that and how to frame the 3 lessons that the story of Monica showed about a good death. I think what we came to the conclusion is that there's not an oncologist or a palliative care clinician who can't bring up a patient when you ask them, do you believe in a bad death? And would you want to die that way? And all of us who've done this over and over again know exactly what we mean when we say bad death. And inevitably, a bad death is the opposite of what Monica experienced in the story. There wasn't acceptance. There wasn't a family around to help take care. And there were symptoms that Monica had that were easily controllable. So if you don't have acceptance, if you don't have friends and family around to help you, and if you have terrible symptoms that are out of control, that's a bad death. And while some of it is out of our control, a lot of it is within our control. And I think this chapter, the reason why we decided to ultimately go with it is to make that point. In clinic, we are always trying to, tell people. In fact, we're arguing with patients, I would say more often than not to do chemotherapy, not to keep pursuing that clinical trial, not to go for that, phase 1 trial that's available in New York or Boston or Philly, which is our access. And so, and the perception in the media and in the public is different. They think that the public is constantly saying, I don't want to do it, but the doctor's making me do it. I would say that anybody who's done this job, 9 times out of 10, it's the patient's arguing for more, and you're trying to convince the patient not to. And so that's why it's a long-winded explanation, but it's why we ultimately said the chapter needs to be there.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing, though, is that there's probably a lot more influences because you can open up magazines and you can see ads for cancer centers that say, we won't give up on you. You can see commercials. We've had a past Jerry Pal post where we just included a bunch of commercials of cancer centers saying that we will never give up on you, or do you have fight, come to us. So I think, and even in messages like with John McCain, there is this battle analogy where it's like a good versus bad, kind of like good death versus bad death. So I think there's influences that patients may not even realize that may be changing how they're thinking.
Right. And I do think that the problem, another really problematic message is this battle metaphor, right? Because what Dave and I are continually saying to people is, unfortunately, it's the biology, right? Like, you haven't lost if this cancer progresses, it's the biology. I would say, like, for this chapter, I think one piece that I think where we settled was that we wanted to say from our own experience what we, as Dave was saying, what we felt like were deaths that could be different. And I think acceptance doesn't mean like this kumbaya moment where everybody is great about it and everybody's like all around them, like with Monica. Like, that doesn't happen with everybody. And there are patients who we care for, who we try to help them along the way. And we have difficult ones we share sometimes. And those folks may end up that may be necessary that they die in the intensive care unit. And that is, and what I always say when I'm teaching this stuff, and we teach a bunch of this stuff like in our courses at the HMS Center for Palliative Care, is we have failed not if the patient dies in the ICU. We have failed if we haven't tried to talk with them about what that will really look like, what our worries are, and that there are alternatives, and that we're going to stay partnered with them no matter what happens. That's when we failed. So I think we can't. The other piece that we tried to do with the book was to try to have it be honest and open about how we feel and how we're emotionally connected to our patients. And we feel badly when patients are suffering at the very end of life. It's hard. It's hard for us too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if readers or listeners to this podcast are interested in learning more about the book, is there a website that they can go to?
Yeah, there is. It's called livingwithcancerbook.com.
Great.
Terrific.
Well, we'd like to thank you both for joining us today. Maybe Alex can take us off with a little verse at the end.
You're welcome to join in over there on the East Coast. On a rattlesnake speedway in the Utah desert, I pick up my money, head back into town, driving across the Waynesboro County line. I got my radio on, but I'm just killing time, working all day in my daddy's garage, driving all night, chasing some mirage. Pretty soon, little girl, I'm gonna take charge. The dogs on Main Street howl 'cause they understand. If I could take one moment into my hands, Mister, I ain't a boy, no, I'm a man, and I believe in the promised land.
Well done.
Terrific.